Thanks, Peggy. We're trying to work out a couple of technical issues. We think we've worked them out, but if anybody quits hearing me at any point, you know, send something in the chat or whatever, and we'll try to figure this out real quick. So thank you for participating in this first of the Zoom informational webinars on the SASP grant. I assume several of you have probably applied for these before, and a lot of it is going to be similar, but there have been a few changes, and we just kind of want to go over and clarify a few things, a lot of which you would see also in the funding announcement, but mostly to also give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have before you set forth on writing your grant and then decide that something doesn't make sense. So we're hoping that you have a chance to kind of look it over and, you know, have an opportunity to ask questions. Peggy, you want to go ahead and advance this? We promise this worked. Let's see. Okay, so most of you are probably aware that SASP, or the Sexual Assault Services Program, is part of VAWA. This grant is to go directly to survivors of sexual assault. So this is not the money that you would use to do education in the schools. This is money that is specifically to provide a direct service to adult survivors. So for that reason, child advocacy centers aren't applying for this money. Human trafficking folks aren't applying for this money. It's specifically for adult survivors of sexual assault. So this money actually goes from the feds over to the Texas office of the governor. From there, it goes to TASA, and we're the pass-through agency which administers the program. And then TASA subcontracts with the organizations who are actually doing all the grant activities. So that would be y'all. So there's kind of two pieces to this. We either provide grants to the rape crisis centers, the sexual assault programs, obviously some of them are dual centers, or also to some culturally specific programs that are providing direct services to adult survivors. These, again, would be for survivors who are not eligible to receive HHSC funding for domestic violence services. So that's why we do understand that you will occasionally have a domestic violence survivor who is being served with these monies, but this is not for somebody who's presenting to your organization as a domestic violence victim who's in your shelter or whatever, and then has sexual assault as a piece of their victimization. Okay, Peggy? So this is a competitive grant. There obviously are specific eligibility requirements. We anticipate that we'll be able to fund 10 to 15 projects. Now that is a little bit fluid because, as you know, when the money comes down from the Fed, sometimes there is a surprise. But generally speaking, the last several years when it's come through, we have gotten relatively in the neighborhood of the amount of money that they said. So, we're anticipating there'll be 10 to 15 projects. And again, depending on how much folks are applying for. The applicants will be scored on their responses. They are being scored by non-TASA staff. And I know that that's a decision that was made so that we have a little bit of a firewall there, that the TASA staff who's providing you a lot of great technical assistance isn't the same people deciding whether which member is getting money. So, it's just to provide a little bit more of a firewall there. So, to find out. Okay.
Okay. You may want to let Angela know.
Somebody might want to. Somebody might want to mute themselves. Can you mute yourself if you're, because I know that it's hard to do a webinar without people coming in and interrupting you. So sexual assault programs, obviously, we want folks that can meet the definition of a rape crisis center, and it's spelled out in the funding announcement, but meet the definition of a sexual assault program in Chapter 420 of the Texas Government Code, meet the Texas Minimum Services Standards, hold an OAG sexual assault training program certificate, or have applied for the OAG sexual assault training certificate, and must be certified within 6 months of receiving this grant. And I think this is important so folks don't worry that you're going to have these brand new organizations who all of a sudden see that money's available and they kind of come out of the woodwork and decide that they can do something that your agency's been doing for 20 years kind of thing. So everybody is kind of being held to the same standard here. We also are providing funding for a few culturally specific programs also defined in the funding announcement, but basically it's programs that are developed by a certain population for a certain population. And I think that that's incredibly important that there are some funds that are set aside for this, because there's a lot of folks who don't reach out to a traditional rape crisis center for any number of reasons. And we want to make sure that we're providing culturally competent and culturally appropriate and linguistically appropriate services as needed. And we also want to make sure that as people are writing these grants, that they understand that they need to include a sexual assault advocate on the grant at least 50% time. So, we have in the past seen folks who kind of piecemealed and put things together, but frequently they're not actually devoting enough time to really kind of get the traction on those direct services. And so make sure as you're writing your grant that it's including a sexual assault advocate on that grant at least 50% time. Okay, Peggy? So the project period, this grant will start on October 1st and run through September 30th. There is 2 years of funding, but you're only going to get the 12 months initially. It can be refunded for a second year non-competitively. And I think this is one of the things that a lot of folks have questions on in prior years. So the reason that you're not applying for all 24 months up front is essentially to be able to see if folks are able to accomplish what they're setting out, and also that we don't have any issues with folks who are not turning in reports, who aren't submitting their FSRs and kind of those administrative things. But barring any of that, you will get funding again for that second year. Okay.
Annette, do you want to take questions along the way, or do you want to wait till the end? I think there was a question already about an advocate.
Yeah, we can go ahead and do it now. I'm not good at checking the chat while I'm also talking. So,
yeah. So the question is, can you define advocate?
Yeah, so that would be the person who is providing the direct service to the sexual assault survivor. So we're talking about somebody who's either doing, your accompaniment, who is doing crisis intervention, who's doing counseling, who's providing some kind of direct service. So we're using the term advocate in kind of a broad sense there, but we just want to make sure that they're providing a direct service as opposed to they're also the volunteer coordinator, they're also the outreach coordinator, they're also the school-based education person, those kinds of things, because those are not activities that could be funded with this particular grant. All right, so year one and year two, both 12-month grants. The minimum amount to apply for is $40,000. The maximum is 150,000. And we know that that is quite a range. But what we find is that different programs have different needs. And we've had some programs who wanted to write a grant that's specifically for, master level interns to, provide counseling for sexual assault survivors, and they need a much more modest budget. They wouldn't be able to spend $150,000 specifically on that. Whereas other folks are doing very different projects, maybe multiple counties and things like that, and they would need a lot more resources to be able to accomplish what their goals are. So we're aware that that's quite a range, but that's another reason why we don't know whether 10 or 15 people, or I shouldn't say people, but organizations will get funding, considering that the proposals may be so vastly different. Okay. So the only date that's probably super important at this point is the final day to submit this application. You can see that it's been open for a couple of weeks, but we have to get this application submitted by the 18th of August. So if you don't submit this by the 18th of August, you will be taken out of the eligibility pool. I really want to encourage folks not to wait to the last day. I know that that's frequently how crisis centers work, because the things that have, the crisis is going to get all the attention right now, and grants kind of don't fall into that category. The problem is we've had some folks who've had some technical problems. They've had, their electricity goes out, the last day, they've had problems with their computers, lots of, valid reasons that they couldn't get it submitted, but the 18th is hard and fast. And so we're hoping that folks can actually plan ahead a little and realize that these kinds of things come up, and, doing it the last minute, you are taking the chance that you're not going to be able to get it through. We hope to have the notice of awards by the 1st of September. We want folks to know, so because we understand you also, in many cases, need to hire staff, you need to do planning, that kind of thing. So we're trying to get the turnaround as quickly as possible. And then the project start date will be October 1st.
And Annette, there's another question. So they wanted to confirm that it needs to be one individual staff person who is at 50% and not the equivalent of that across a few positions.
Correct. Okay, so applications will be submitted using Form Assembly. You see the link right here where you'll be able to go on and get those things submitted. I think it's a very simple format. You're not going through your porthole where in many cases, there's only one person in the agency who has access to it and those kinds of things. So I think that TASA did a great job trying to get this all set up in a way that is as user-friendly as possible. Okay. So some of the things that you'll need to include with that is a signed board resolution. We understand that occasionally your board meetings come at a different time. So if your agency only has quarterly board meetings and the quarter isn't in during this time that the application's been open, then you can submit, paperwork that says when your board meeting is and those kinds of things. So you're not going to be excluded if you weren't able to do that for a legitimate reason, but it's certainly something that you're going to have to get before you will be eligible for the money. We also want job descriptions for the staff that's on this grant. And I think that this is important because, people have a variety of things that they call folks who might be doing very similar work. But this is, I think, especially important for individuals who are wearing, many hats, that we know that there's something in that job description that is specifically talking about the work they're doing with direct services to sexual assault survivors. We would like a copy of your SATP certificate or a copy of the application that you've submitted. And then also you will submit a work plan and a budget for the first year. So the purpose of the grant, and we think that this is usually pretty clear, but it becomes obvious it's not as clear to some folks as we think it is. These are direct services to adult survivors of sexual assault who are not already receiving services for domestic violence for that victimization. An exception to that is adults molested as children are eligible to receive services for their victimization. And we understand that, if you have a 35-year-old and they were sexually assaulted at 11, it could have been something that was, domestic violence related at that time, but they're seeking services now, and they're not reaching out to your agency as a domestic violence survivor. They're reaching out to your agency because of the sexual victimization they experienced as a child, but now they're an adult who needs services. So is everybody kind of clear on what the difference is there? Because we don't want to set anybody up to fail with this. And if we get a lot of folks that are submitting reports later, and it looks like that these are all domestic violence folks, there's a problem there because it's not the intent of the grant. Also, if you're serving a bunch of young children, we're certainly not implying that this is not critically important work, but this grant really can only serve, it's intended for adults, and it can be used to serve your 14 to 17-year-olds in addition to those adults, but it's fairly narrow as far as who this is intended to focus on. So as far as program requirements, as a rape crisis center, you're providing a direct service. We're wanting to make sure that you're illustrating that you're using effective healing methods, and that primarily adult survivors of sexual assault is who you're working with. If you're a culturally specific community-based organization, we want you to improve the access to sexual assault services for marginalized and underserved communities within the population that your organization focuses on, and also who is assaulted by someone other than a recent household member. And the reason I worded it that way is we don't want, again, adults that were molested as children to say, well, they were a household member, so I'm not eligible to receive those services. We're talking about folks who, and we say recent because if you moved out 3 days ago, then we have some folks who say, well, they're no longer a family member. So I'm hoping that provides a little bit more of an illustration of what we're talking about there. All applicants must have at least one staff member who's providing direct services to sexual assault on the grant at least 50% time. So that's kind of what we talked about a couple of minutes ago. Primarily survivors of sexual assault who are adults. Again, we talked about the 14 to 17-year-olds, particularly at the culturally specific organizations, but certainly at your organization, you may occasionally also be working with that age group who's getting direct services at your organization, and they would qualify. Sexual assault survivors abused by a family member who are not eligible for HHSC funded services, or the possibility that we still have some unserved counties in this state. And so if there are no funded HHSC funded services and those available, and there's nowhere for this sexual assault survivor to go, obviously, and they reach out to your agency, they would be qualified as well. So reporting, your reports are completed in form assembly. So we're going to have quarterly reports, and we've done this a variety of ways. So for folks who've been on this grant for multiple years, you know, there was a time there was quarterly reports, and then it was semi-annual reports. We're going back to quarterly reports. And one of the reasons we're going to quarterly reports is that when you only do it semi-annually, if people are having a problem meeting their grant objectives, we kind of find out about it a little bit too late to actually help provide the technical assistance and help people kind of work through and problem solve. So the quarterly reports for the first and third quarter may look different than the ones from the second and fourth quarter. There may be less information on every other quarterly report because we may just be problem solving. And the reason I'm being vague is because it hasn't been developed yet, but it is something that we've been talking about so that we get enough information to be able to help and to problem solve, but not provide such an extensive report that this is frankly just a big thorn in your side. And with all the other amount of work that you have to do, we don't want you to be involved in busy work. We want this to be meaningful and, give us what we need and not a bunch of busy work for you. The annual report, which lots of folks have been frustrated with, including myself, because the annual report is from a calendar year. So it's going to be, and usually comes out, we give it to folks in January, it's due in early February, and it's for the preceding calendar year. I'm still not sure who's, in the infinite wisdom of somebody in some federal government department decided to have an annual report that spans 2 grant years. All I can do is assure you that that was not TASA's idea, and it wasn't even the governor's office's idea. That comes from the feds, and so it is kind of a pain because sometimes you're a new grantee and you didn't even start your grant until October 1st, and you're going to be doing an annual report in February that's just for October, November, and December. And someone else who was on the grant prior is going to be splitting it between 2 grant years and telling us what they did 9 months on the last grant and 3 months on this grant. So just know, we know that it's confusing, that it doesn't make sense, but it's what we are forced to live with. And, if there's any way we can help you with that, we will, but it's kind of something we've inherited and we're stuck with. We're also going to have folks do an expense log for third-party payments, so items that were purchased for survivors. So this is a new area that was not previously allowed on this grant. So now up to 10% of your grant can actually be spent for items that the survivor, a sexual assault survivor, might need as a result of that victimization. So that might mean, they haven't been able to go to work, and so they need help paying their utilities, or the building they live in is not safe, and for some reason they're not eligible for crime victims comp, and they need a deposit for a new place, or maybe they just need their locks changed and they can't afford it, or maybe the perpetrator took their telephone and they need a new telephone, or they need new sheets, or those kinds of things. And it's spelled out in the funding announcement, so you'll know what kinds of things are covered. It's still the case that you cannot give direct payments to survivors. You can't give vouchers to survivors. You can't give gas cards to survivors directly, because that's against the regulations. But they do allow third-party payments. So if you went and bought something at Walmart, or you had a locksmith that would go do the work for you and you paid them, or you went and paid their utilities. Those kinds of things you will be able to do, but we will want that to be logged separately so we know what is going out for a third-party payment for items for survivors. And I anticipate some of you may have questions on that, but I do think it's talked about in pretty good detail in the funding announcement. But should you have any questions after reading the funding announcement and you're still unclear, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to, listen to what you have in mind and give you some feedback on whether that's going to meet the criteria or not. Peggy? So this is just, again, it's in the funding announcement, but it just tells you, it's just where you can find on the TASA website, specifically, where's the funding announcement, where's the grant application, where's the instructions, where's the questions, has some templates and those kinds of things. So I think the staff did a great job of putting it all in there together in one place to make it easier to get this grant assembled. Okay. So next steps. Well, one of the things I think it's really important is try to read the funding announcement in its entirety. That kind of gives you a much better idea of the grant requirements. And I think a lot of times, just based on time, we have a habit when we see a fairly long document of just skimming through it. But I think if you actually, before you even start writing the grant, if you just sit down, read the funding announcement, print it out if necessary, write your notes, whatever you need to do, I think you'll find that writing the grant is going to be a lot simpler. Develop your project using the funding announcement as a tool to plan your activities. So again, it's going to talk to you about what are eligible activities. That way you don't end up having your score reduced because you're putting in activities that are not going to be covered in this grant. And I know we talk about this, but I know every year we do get proposals that are otherwise pretty good proposals from really good organizations, but the person who's writing the grant, I don't think is the one who actually read the funding announcement. I think there's a disconnect there. And so they'll spend lots of time talking about, their work in schools and other kinds of things that really are not appropriate for this particular grant. So please read that and make sure whoever is the individual who's writing your grant has actually read that as well. Use the link for form assembly, again, that's on the TASA's grant announcement webpage to complete the announcement. Don't wait till the last minute to submit because those technical issues happen. Thank God Peggy was on this call with me before even this. If I had come in 5 minutes before, we would be in trouble right now. Await the funding decision. We expect to send the notifications by September 1st. Again, we're going to do our best to make sure that a month out, y'all know about this so you can make your plans. I'm not saying that things don't ever come up, but I think we are really going to be expediting this process as much as possible to give you as much lead time, because I know as someone who counted on grants for my staff for a lot of years, finding out, 4 days before, whether you have to lay people off or hire people is unacceptable. So we're really trying to give you as much lead time as possible. Okay. If you need technical assistance, TASA support team, is available. I have an individual, I'm a contractor, so I'm not on TASA staff. I try to be available. I don't believe I ever make it more than, 12 hours without answering an email. That's also my personal cell phone number. So call me if you need to call me. I will promise if I didn't answer your call, I am going to call you back and I'm going to get back to you. I would suggest that you use the SASP at TASA.org. I know some people will email me directly. The good thing about using SASP at TASA.org is I see it, Tim Love sees it, you know, the person who's cutting the teeth sees it. So there's multiple people who see it. And so your question is less likely to fall through the cracks. And hopefully the most appropriate person is going to address that for you. To remember that the TASA staff can't, they can answer general questions on the grant about eligibility and programming and stuff like that, but we cannot assist writing the grant for you. And we can't look at your proposal and tell you, yes, that's a good one. Yes, it's good, submit it. So, you know, just make sure which kinds of questions, because we don't want to frustrate you by reaching out and you emailing us a proposal that we then are not allowed to go over. But questions prior to that on eligibility and programming and those kinds of things, we certainly can answer. Okay. So are there any questions so far? I'm not seeing any on the chat there.
So Annette, I just put the link to the announcement in the chat. And when you go to that link, it has all of the application documents there. So you'll see everything, including the link directly to the application. Just put it in the chat.
Thank you. That's helpful. Tim, I see you're on here too. Is there anything that you would like to share that maybe you think needs to be clearer?
No, well, I did want to say hello to everyone. It's nice to see your faces or your names. And thanks for taking time out today. And I think you did a really good job covering everything. So yeah, I don't have anything different to add.
Okay. So if you're like me, you think of all your questions in 30 minutes, and feel free to send me an email, to give me a call. I'm happy to answer your questions as they come out. Sometimes it's not until you see the application that you have questions. So I understand that, and I will make myself as available as I can to help you through this. So just let me know how I can help.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. See lots of familiar names. Nice to see y'all.
Kind of hang out for a little bit if folks want to let folks filter out and ask questions, or you're welcome to take back a little bit more of your day.
Thanks. Okay, I'm here by myself, but my doorbell's ringing, so I'm going to come right back. Okay.
And I'm going to stop the recording. And